Welcome to Mysteries, Graveyards, and the Human Psyche. This is a show about authentic, deep connection to the in-between spaces. Join us as we explore the boundaries between the living and the dead, heaven and earth, between everyday life and the initiation into the unseen realms. I'm your host, Melissa B. Episode 4, The Grotesques. I am an alumna of CUNY City College in Manhattan, and I graduated in 2010. I was one of those young people in the New York City Teaching Fellows Program, which meant that my days and my nights were very full. I taught during the day, and in the evenings I attended my graduate courses in education. And so I didn't really have much time to explore this beautiful campus that I was on. I kind of passed the neo-Gothic architecture in a flurry, trying to make it to my evening classes and avoid the ire of any of my professors. And so recently, when a friend invited me to a different part of the campus I had never been on before, I was amazed to find a cemetery of gargoyles in the grass on the side of a hill near the architecture building. And I wanted to know everything about these gargoyles. I wanted to know why they were there, were there any plans for them, and a little bit of research on the internet brought me to a very fine and distinguished gentleman whose name is Dalton Whiteside. He's also an alumnus of City College, the School of Architecture. He's now an architect based in Tennessee. But his tenure there was something that was, I would say, extraordinary, because he began to go back into the illustrious past of City College and has ventured to try to bring this into the present. I hope that you enjoy listening to the interview as much as I enjoyed conducting it. I present to you now Mr. Dalton Whiteside.
From entering the college, like I said, it was just completely awe-inspiring to see the campus, and you can just sense the history there. I mean, you see these murals, you see a pipe organ, you see stained glass, you see banners, you see statues, you see all these unique little caricature figures all over the buildings. They call grotesques, and you just know there's a story behind all of them. And so I went seeking this history, and I found myself at the City College archives. My first line of inquiry was the pipe organ in the Great Hall, because I saw that there were these beautiful gilded facade pipes, but there was no console, which you would expect to see on the stage. And so I went researching to find out what happened to the organ. And that's when I learned it was, when it was installed in 1907, 1908, the largest organ in the city of New York, 3,846 pipes. And at that time, the Great Hall served as a concert hall for organ music. So our first organist, Samuel Atkinson Baldwin, performed 1,362 organ recitals. And the college was sort of a place for the community to come together, and students between classes to stop in the Great Hall and just listen to this classical organ music. And it's such a departure from where we are today, because I think people tend to associate organ music with church, and it's usually somber and not very exciting. But when you hear the classics, Bach and Strauss and Wagner on an organ, and it's just this powerful roaring instrument, and you're in this magnificent hall, it transports you, and it is the voice of the building. And so I did research. I found that the organ, unfortunately, had been thrown away in 1963 and replaced with an Allen electric organ, which uses speakers instead of pipes. And that organ had also been thrown out after being vandalized in 1975. So there was no organ. And I thought, well, that's an awful shame, but maybe if I write a proposal to the college, maybe they'll scrape together alumni who are interested in donating, and we can get this organ back. And how exciting would that be to bring this music back to City College? So that was my first, what I called, endeavor. And I had many different endeavors at the college. And I wrote many proposals for the college. I was always meeting with the VP of developments and the president and talking to alumni. And it was just trying to revive all these historical properties of the college because so much had been lost or forgotten or thrown away. And I thought, like, well, if only we can rally the alumni, surely people are going to want to donate towards these, because who wouldn't want to have their name on, this massive organ or this lost, statue or fountain or planetarium. So there's a lot of exciting history at the college.
Yeah, including those grotesques, as you call them. I did not know until doing a little bit of research that a gargoyle is a ornamentation that will funnel water through itself, but the grotesque is just a design. So can you tell us a little bit about these grotesques?
Yes. So George Brown Post was the architect of those North Campus buildings. And the college was originally downtown in a building called the Free Academy. And they had outgrown that building by the turn of the century. So they began looking for a new site for an expanded campus in 1902. And construction officially began on the campus that we know today in 1903. So it was around that time when they actually sent out a competition for architects to submit bids. And George Post initially submitted a proposal for a Beaux-Arts style campus, which would have been similar to Columbia University, very neoclassical in fashion. However, the Board of Higher Education preferred the neo-Gothic look, which I think in part was because their original building was a neo-Gothic structure. And he submitted a second proposal, and he did these beautiful illustrations and extraordinary detail. But the grotesques were drawn out by George Post's office, and then they were sculpted by Carl Bitter, who was a very well-known sculptor. And they were produced by the Perth Amboy Terracotta Company, Perth Amboy, New Jersey. And it was a unique choice on George Post's part to design a campus using this white glazed terracotta and this native quarried Manhattan schist, which is that dark stone. And they call City College, the college of the subway, because that schist was quarried from the IRT, the Interborough Rapid Transit System subway, the 123 train. That was being dug out in 1904, just as the campus buildings were being built from 1903 to 1907. So as they quarried them, they had horses, and they would gather all these stones and carry them up the hill, and they would build the college buildings out of them. My connection with the grotesques, actually kind of segueing from the story I told you in the beginning when I began researching the pipe organ. And I actually formed a committee to try to get a new pipe organ. And I met the architect who's been restoring the neo-Gothic campus since 1986, Carl Stein, from the firm Elemental Architecture. And he was just a fascinating man. I mean, I had been admiring those buildings for years up to that point. And I had studied so many details in the stained glass and the organ and every little thing. I could give you the dates and the numbers and the people's names and all that, because it was an obsession for me. So when I met Carl Stein, he was like, he's an idol to me. He still is to this day. I really admire the work he's done, him and his team. It's been a huge effort. And this will partly explain the condition you saw those grotesques in. But the campus, it was a bit of a flaw on the part of the design by George Post, and that is that he designed all these terracotta elements as load-bearing stones. So on the facade, each of the stones above them were weighing down on the terracotta below. And so a lot of cracking occurred. And these buildings have a skeleton of steel, which is what supports them. And even though they look medieval Gothic, there's a reason we call it Neo-Gothic. It's New Gothic, built very popular at the turn of the century. And with the invention of the Bessemer process to further refine and strengthen steel, which enabled the construction of skyscrapers, that same process was used to hold up these buildings. And you see these buttresses, which are kind of stone bracing for the Great Hall, as you would typically see in a cathedral. You see a lot of elements like that, but in fact, they're just decorative. So we've got this skin of Neo-Gothic surrounded by a very, contemporary structure. But with the cracking, water got in and a freeze thawed, expanded, creating a lot of spalling. And the steel rusted in some places down to paper thin. And so even by the 1920s and 30s, the Neo-Gothic campus was becoming blackened with New York City soot. And cracks and were showing up everywhere, and a spalling, which means the face would kind of shear off of many of the terracotta pieces, occurred everywhere. So by the 1970s and 80s, the buildings were in horrible condition. The main tower of Shepherd Hall, the tallest tower, was clad in chicken wire, the top 75 feet of it, just because these pieces the size of grapefruits were falling from hundreds of feet in the air, and created a severe safety hazard. And there's these different little elements and faces, and there's even some gargoyles, there's grotesques, all these little features. Many were cracking off and falling, and the buildings were so blackened with soot, it just looked awful. So DASNY, the Dormitory Authority of the State of New York, they're the ones that own the campus buildings and are responsible for their maintenance, decided to finally scrape the money together for this multi-million-dollar restoration. So that's been going on since 1986. Originally, Carl Stein and his firm, originally known as the Stein Partnership, they were hired just to analyze and reconstruct the top 75 feet of the main tower, which have those very intricate white turrets on the four corners. There's a lot of terracotta. And they also, after they completed that, and it looked beautiful, it was shining, and they were able to reconstruct all of the pieces the way they would have originally appeared. And they later did an analysis on the rest of the building and found out that the whole structure was at a point where it could collapse at any moment. So that's when they began to shut down the Great Hall and start to renovate in sections until they finished. I think they just finished in maybe 2015 or so, maybe 2016.
Wow. So that's what happened to those grotesques. That's why they're in the grass on the side of the hill.
Well, I should probably start by telling you why they're there in the
Okay.
first place, because what it is during that renovation, they did not replace the terracotta with terracotta. They took off all of those original terracotta pieces, thousands of them, and they
All of the
replaced them
grotesques.
with grotesques, yeah, and they're
Okay.
all made of terracotta. So I often, there's florets, grotesques, cornice pieces, gargoyles. There's so many names for each of the elements. I often just group them into the terracotta.
Ah.
But so those pieces were removed and sent out to recasting facilities out in New Jersey, upstate New York, I think some in Texas, some in New Mexico. They were just sent all over the place because I believe there was an article about it being like the largest terracotta restoration project in the country, because there was just so much. And so they were casting these historic pieces, and in many cases, key elements had broken off, and so they had to use photos to try to reconstruct them. And they had sculptors go in and create plaster kind of corrections for anything that was missing, and then they would do a cast of it, and then they would create replicas out of glass fiber reinforced concrete. So you can think of like a bathtub. It's that kind of construction,
Okay.
and it had
Much
sort of
longevity for that.
right, and so they're supported with a kind of a fiberglass interior, and there's and they're really kind of a concrete mix. But these pieces were able to look identical to the originals, and many different materials were tested with a stress test, and they determined that was the best material to use. So these glass fiber reinforced concrete recasts were sent from these recasting facilities back to the college and put onto the buildings. And they had to create a new skeletal frame on the inside of steel to hold up each of these pieces, to fix that issue of, each of the stones kind of weighing on each other. With the new design, none of it would weigh on each other. Each element would be able to support, it would be resting independently on this steel frame. So then the question became, what do we do with all of these original terracotta pieces? Many were broken and blackened with soot, and they were all over the country. What DASNY did is they hired Carl Stein to go around and select the ones that were worth keeping the most. And he had those shipped back to college, and they were put into storage. And then I think in later years, more started to come back to the college, the less desirable ones, but the college didn't know what to do with them or where to put them. And so as the campus continued to develop, and there was construction going on South Campus while they demolished the old Herman Goldman athletic field and some of the old convent buildings, they were putting these big, swatches of grotesques, big clusters, over here, and then they need to use that area for construction. So they'd move the whole cluster over there, and they needed that. All right, they're going to move it over there. So this field of grotesques just kept moving around, and the college lost track of how many they had and where they were. And I had met people over the years, friends who worked in a firm that had done work for the college, and I'm like, oh yeah, we have one of those in our office. And I had gone to professors' offices, and they had one there, and I heard stories of students running off with them to their dorms and keeping pieces. And so in 2015, I by that point I was very much involved with the college, and I had done many different proposals and endeavors, and so the college knew I was very interested in the history. And the Dean of Architecture, Gordon Giebert, recommended me to the facilities department to catalog the grotesques, because they wanted to get an accurate count of how many they had, where they were, what condition they were in. They wanted to get photos of them, dimensions, everything. And so I began doing that as a bit of a side job. And I had been wanting to work with facilities for a long time. Like, my two favorite places was archives and facilities department. But facilities was very tight-knit and not easy to get in with them. And, the only jobs available were janitorial or security. And it's like, well, that's not what I'm looking for. I want to help with the floor plans. I want to help renovate the buildings. So I set out to catalog these grotesques, and behind the School of Architecture, you may know it as Cohen Library when you were there, there were 3 large metal dumpster bins full of grotesques. And I had cataloged everything else on the campus. I went through every building, every room, and photographed, measured, documented everything into an Excel spreadsheet. But these 3 big metal dumpster bins, I told facilities, I can't catalog them. I did climb up into them, and I looked over, but these things are super heavy, and they're all on top of each other. I said, we're going to have to spread these out. And so about 2 months later, I looked out the window of the Spitzer School, and 538 grotesques were spread out over the South Campus lawn. Just insane. And I thought, oh my God, I've got my work cut out for me. 'Cause I thought, maybe there's 20 per bin or something. I don't know. But gosh, 538. And so I went out there and I began to catalog them. And the facilities department and I were going back and forth about how should we label them because we need to number them. Uh, you know, who's going to photograph them? You're going to take measurements. So anyway, I went through and cataloged them, and
one of the distinguishing characteristics about these grotesques is that each of them embody the different disciplines that were taught in these neo-Gothic buildings on the North Campus. So you'll see some grotesques are jumping hoops or lifting weights, and those are from our gymnasium building, Wingate Hall. You'll see some that are pouring beakers and skulls and crossbones, and those are actually from our chemistry building, currently known as Baskerville Hall. And you'll see others that are craftsmen and masons and artists, and those are from our mechanical arts building known as Compton Hall. So it's kind of fun when you look at these grotesques, you can kind of see what building they originally came from, and each of them are individually very unique.
Soon enough, the students discovered this huge field of grotesques, and they called it the Grotesque Graveyard. That's the name it got on Twitter and all the social media accounts out there. And I think there were some articles that went out, and like the Daily Mail wanted to do something, and they wanted to come and interview the Dean of Architecture because it was just this curiosity. And someone took a picture of one of them and added the black and white tint, and I think it went viral. And then that same picture was used in the college calendar, and it was just everywhere. Grotesque Graveyard, Grotesque Graveyard. And in that process, I had found there was a security guard that was stationed at a nearby gate on South Campus. And so when I wasn't there, that guard would keep an eye out on the grotesques. And sometimes when I would come in the morning to catalog, they would say, "Oh yeah, some student tried to come by and grab this." And there was one case where a student had tried to grab a head of Lady Justice, which is one of the statues from the front of Shepherd Hall. That was sculpted by Jeremiah Grandelis. There's only two sculptors, Carl Bitter and Jeremiah Grandelis. And Livingston Smith was the gentleman in the office of George Post that actually designed the characters. So those are the three main names you should know. But anyway, some student tried to run off with the head of Lady Justice, and they dropped it. And so I thought, well, the responsible thing to do is to hold on to this. So I'll hold on to it until I'm done cataloging, and then I'll give it to facilities department when I'm done. And it took a while for me to finish. It was a lot of work. And eventually, and I had it just sitting on my desk in the School of Architecture. And then eventually when I finished my work, I tried to hand it over to facilities, and they didn't know what to do with it. They just keep it. We don't need it. And I ended up giving it to the Dean of Architecture because I had switched studios, and it was like, he's probably a good person to hold on to this.
Yeah, so these grotesques have certainly lived a long life, both being a part of the buildings, but also having been moved around so many times over the years. So they've certainly been worn down, but nonetheless, they're very important to the City College community and to the college administrators, which continue to look for a long-term solution for their storage and hopefully their display. Despite the fact that we have had some that have been taken away, I highly discourage anyone from taking any of them because they really are part of our community. And I think they're there for everyone to enjoy, to learn from, and just to make the college a little bit more beautiful.
Sure, it makes it interesting, much more interesting too.
For sure, yeah.
But there's one more question that I really wanted to ask you, but it's what is the heart of architecture? What is the spirit or the soul of architecture or studying architecture?
Mm. Well, I think it's the people, surprisingly. I mean, you would think it would be the building or the details, but having now, I'm writing this book about all these buildings. These buildings would be nothing without the people that had the dream to build them and the architects that invented they came up with all these ideas. And every ornament, every technique, a rounded window or a Gothic pointed arch, or a sill, or the way a stone is cut, or the material that was chosen, a slate roof or a copper cupola, brownstone versus schist or terracotta, concrete, and then you look at the overall composition and you acknowledge what style it is. This is art moderne, and this is Rundbogenstil, or this is neo-Renaissance or Second Empire, and each of those derives from a particular point in history and someone else that came up with those defining characteristics that we now associate with those different styles. I can give you, for an example, in the Second Empire fashion, everyone knows the Addams Family Mansion, and if you look at any building and you want to know if it's Second Empire, just look for that steeply pitched roof, like the Addams Family roof. That was invented by Louis Mansart, who used that design at Versailles. And then it became very popular in the 1870s, 1880s here in America, all over I don't want to say all over the world, but definitely in New York. And you find that even at City College. And, as I'm writing about these buildings, I'm just inundated with so many names of people that, and I'm getting into that kind of detail too, because I want to. Even though it may be boring for some readers, I think it's important to acknowledge not just the figureheads, the visionary and the architect, and that's it. I mean, I want to know who was the mason, who installed the pipe organ, who did the stained glass, where did it come from, where did each of these elements come from that were brought together from many different places and many different talented people. And then once you've got this building, you tell the story of what makes this building special, and you learn these stories of these important events that happened within, and, protests and famous people that visited the college. I mean, we had Albert Einstein, W.E.B. Du Bois, we had Ravi Shankar, we have had presidents. But then there's also everyday people. Just as you would analyze a building, not just for its figureheads, but also for all the individual craftsmen, you look at not just the famous people who visited this building, but the everyday students that had classes there, that might have spent an all-nighter in, doing their schoolwork. And, they earned their degrees in this building. They changed their lives because they had an education. And then they went on to have extraordinary careers, and they've changed the lives of their children and their children's children for having, gone into their given profession. People pursuing their dreams, and that's the story of buildings. It's the story of people. So that's what's exciting about buildings.
I love that. Oh, that was so beautiful. I felt very moved listening to you speak about that.
Oh, you're sweet.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure meeting with you and talking with you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Mysteries, Graveyards, and the Human Psyche. Tune in next time for more exciting content. This episode featured music by Kevin MacLeod and Lee Chernowitz.